Is it crazy that we saw Aaron Rodgers already walking with crutches, putting weight on his foot, just over a couple of weeks out from his surgery this past Sunday as the Jets took on the Chiefs? We'll talk about it in this video. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer. My goal in this channel is to help teach you about the medical side of the sports world. And I gotta say, this video of Aaron Rodgers seen walking on the sidelines, using some crutches, but still putting some weight through this surgically operated Achilles has been driving all kinds of conversation across social media. Rodgers was on the Pat McAfee show today talking about this in more detail. So let's just walk through this whole thing because I think people are missing a lot of really important nuance with this whole conversation of, is this crazy? Is he going to come back this season? What the heck is going on with this fancy speed bridge, etc. When I posted about this video on Twitter, I got all kinds of responses from people mainly talking about their own personal experience. You know, this is not normal, should be in a boot at least 6 weeks, foot should be plantar flexed. Everybody seemed to have this opinion based on their own personal experience from either their own Achilles surgery, a different surgery, a family member's surgery. And really the biggest takeaway with this is, number one, we can't compare one person's Achilles injury and subsequent surgery to another because there is so much variation between not only where the Achilles rupture occurred anatomically in the muscle or tendon, and then what surgical technique was used and what's their specific post-op rehab. Because there, you can just Google Achilles rupture post-operative rehab and you will see countless different protocols out there with little variations in terms of weight bearing, early weight bearing, late weight bearing, etc. So number one, we can't look at Rodgers' example and say, well, my Achilles, I was on a boot for 6 weeks, so his surgeon must be crazy, or my surgeon was crazy. There's tons of variety here, and that doesn't mean that any of these individual approaches are necessarily a bad thing. Rodgers is now just over a couple weeks out from his surgery, and he talked about in the interview with Pat McAfee how his goal was to be in a shoe, I believe at the 13-day mark, and now his next goal is to get rid of the crutches. But there's a couple of things with this, because yes, we see him walking, but number one, this is just a snapshot of his day. We don't know how much time he's using the crutches throughout the day. We don't know if he's got a different boot that he's wearing at different times of the day. And so number one, it's normal when people are going through rehab early on that they might have an hour of the day or 30 minutes of the day initially where they're starting to put some weight on that foot. So this might have been the only time that day that he was putting a significant amount of weight on it, but we only saw this part on the camera. Number two, this is partial limited weight bearing, right? We don't see him actually putting all of his weight on that surgically operated left side. As he comes down with the crutches, this is just partial weight bearing. He's maybe only putting 50% or so of his weight through the foot. So it's not even putting that much load necessarily through his Achilles. The other thing I want you to focus on is the difference between his right foot and kind of his stride where he pushes off and his left. He's actually pushing off and plantar flexing the right side, but with the left one, he's kind of just rolling over it and not actually pushing off and going up into plantar flexion. It's almost like if you were to imagine he's in a walking boot with a rigid shoe, he's just rolling over it. He's not actually actively moving the ankle up and down. He's just rolling through his gait. So he's not actually stretching the Achilles in this position. Yes, he's not in the typical walking boot that we're used to seeing, but a walking boot is just restricting you from moving up and down. And so if this type of brace that he's wearing is still restricting that dorsal or plantar flexion, it's accomplishing the same thing. There's also probably a heel lift in his shoe to, again, limit the tension on his Achilles, but he's not actually pushing off. He's not putting a lot of load through his calf because of how he's more just rolling over on that side rather than pushing up, and like we see with his right gastroc actually firing here. One of the big conversations with Achilles rehab after surgery is early versus kind of standard or delayed mobilization and weight bearing. The old school method of kind of post-op care after an Achilles surgery was to put people in a cast and keep them in a cast for weeks, months. But now we've learned that actually doing earlier mobilization, earlier weight bearing, sometimes even like right away after surgery, might result in better patient satisfaction and doesn't seem to lead to any of the complications we might be afraid of. And so some surgeons are moving towards an earlier functional rehabilitation window, rather that's some weight bearing introduced at 2 weeks or much sooner than that. There are plenty of protocols where people are doing early weight bearing. So that in and of itself is not crazy. Just seeing him putting some weight on 2.5 weeks out is not far-fetched by any means to say that he's being overly aggressive or overly pushing this. And remember, his surgeon is one of the best sports medicine surgeons in the country, and they're not going to let him do something overtly dangerous. Let's take a listen now to some of his comments when he was on Pat McAfee's show today and kind of weigh in on my thoughts regarding that. Because initially, I wasn't as worried when I saw what he was doing on the field Sunday night, but hearing his comments I am a little bit concerned about how he'll be doing long term. Let's talk.
The first goal was really to be able to be upright, to be out of a boot, and to be able to do some semblance of walking by the time I got back. Now the next goal is to be able to walk without crutches. It's pretty obvious I'm well ahead of the normal protocols when it comes to rehab for this kind of thing.
I don't know if I'd say he's pretty far ahead of normal protocols. Like I said, there's plenty of protocols that allow for this early weight bearing. And so by no means is this like revolutionary. He's rehabbing way, way faster than anybody else would expect. Yes, it's probably faster than the average post Achilles repair protocol, but it's by no means like unusual, something that doctors are going to write about decades from now.
And that was what Neil and I talked about
Neil is Dr. Elatrash. That's the surgeon who operated on him.
Locker room. Honestly, after it happened was, the type of surgery that he'd been doing now for a little bit. And then, whatever protocols were out there, just not adhering to those, being as smart as possible, not trying to stretch the Achilles, but stressing the Achilles in a way that allows me to start doing movement quicker and to speed up.
So this is an important distinction here. And I think it's a little bit strange that he says he was basically trying to kind of disregard some of the protocols and just push it more. But he says something in here about not trying to stretch the Achilles, but trying to stress the Achilles. And that's kind of the one thing that sticks out to me as a concern here with how Rodgers pushes this down the road. I think what you have to understand in his situation is he's not a basketball player. He's not a running back. He's an older quarterback who essentially is pretty stationary during the majority of his job unless he has to scramble. A lot of the increased kind of low difficulty with coming back from an Achilles repair is that running. It's the jumping. It's the explosive activity, stuff that Rodgers doesn't necessarily have to do a lot of. And so I think functionally he can tolerate less of an optimal return in performance compared to somebody like a Cam Akers or a basketball player. The talk about trying to not stretch it but to stress it is really important, because if you think of the whole complex of the Achilles, the muscle transitions into the tendon then anchors into the bone. There's a certain innate level of tension that muscle is able to build up and transmit energy through the Achilles. If you do a surgical repair of an Achilles and it heals in a lengthened or a stretched position, you lose some of that natural ability of the calf complex to store and transmit energy. And so you can have basically a looser muscle. You can have a muscle that's not as powerful and doesn't have that same force curve relationship as the previously healthy muscle. But in somebody like Rodgers, that might not be as much of an impact. He might not be as affected by that compared to, again, say, a running back. Walking on things early, progressing your rehab faster than maybe would be generally accepted or desired, my concern is that it would cause the Achilles to heal in more of a stretched, lengthened position. But again, if that's part of the risk that Rodgers is willing to accept and tolerate in order to maybe get back sooner, given, again, how old he is in his career, I think those are the factors at play here. And so when people talk about, is it crazy for him to come back in 5 months? Yes, if you just look across the board in an Achilles injury, that's not something at all that normal patients should ever expect or plan for. But if Rodgers has accepted that him coming back early means he plays, but he might have impaired function compared to where he was before, that might be something that you accept when you're at the end of your career, nearing your 40s. You're not going to accept that same risk when you're 20 and fresh out of college, but at his stage, I can understand where he's able to push up that rehab protocol and return protocol, understanding that there might not be as quite of good function at the end if it gets him back for these last couple of years, say, in his career.
I will address something else that I saw where somebody said, this is not the 1950s, this is normal. And listen, there's nothing normal about how I'm attacking this rehab.
Okay, so I gotta laugh because that was my tweet, I assume he's referring to, because I commented about how this is the 1950s. And I think, again, he's being a little bit of hyperbole here, right? Because it's not that unexpected with what he's doing. I think him trying to come back in 5 months, sure, that's not normal, but everything about this, again, is not mind-blowingly sort of advanced, crazy levels of medicine. This is stuff that's well within kind of that little bit of wiggle room with the rehab protocols. And so, yes, it's definitely a little bit more. And that wasn't a reference to him, right? That was more of just a reference to people thinking that you had to be in a cast for like a month after you have these surgeries.
There is common practices about 6 weeks in a boot, and I was in a shoe in like 13 days.
in a shoe. But again, if you're in a shoe, but you're wearing a brace that restricts your plantar flexion, it's kind of functionally accomplishing the same thing. So this is kind of like potato from my perspective. Yes, it's earlier than normal, but it's not out of the realm making this extraordinary. Overall, I will say I was pretty impressed listening to this conversation because I think he has a very realistic sort of expectation going into this. I think, like I said, he knows he's at the end of his career. He knows there's a little bit of reason to kind of push things along. And given his position, given his functional demands, he can probably tolerate a little bit less optimal of that endpoint in function. And if you think of, even if it's just a 5% or a 10% strength difference in your calf pre to post, he probably isn't going to notice that like a running back might. And so again, I think what we saw is not crazy. It's a lot closer to normal than I think the average person would expect. But there's so much variety with surgeon type, with procedure type, with post-operative rehab, that you're going to find these little nuances. You should absolutely not expect, if you tear your Achilles, that you're going to be back running, jumping, playing sports in 5 months. That's definitely not ordinary, and there's a lot of risk associated with that and should not be the standard. But again, if we're able to kind of get to that point and toe that line a little bit, accepting some risk in Rodgers' unique case, then who are we to really sit here and argue with what he wants to do? That's it for my thoughts on this. I hope that some of this kind of dies down because there's going to be a point where we see Rodgers off crutches, out of the boot, and we're not really going to be able to tell where he's at just watching him walk on the sidelines. And a lot of this is going to depend on how the Jets are doing. If the Jets aren't doing very well, it's going to slow down his rehab. He's not going to push back and really try to be overly aggressive and take more chances. If the Jets are doing really great, we're probably going to get more of these updates and hear about how he's progressing. And hopefully it goes well. I hope he gets back, doesn't have any complications, does as well as he can. And if it gets him back to where he's at this stage in his career, then more power to him. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.